Hello and welcome to Bread of Life, a daily devotional program which each week features a different area pastor. Our speaker for this week is Pastor Tom Tinker of Meriden.
Hello again, and welcome to another lesson on the divine imitation, made in His image, living His way. Today I'm going to give you a divine illustration. We all know that Jesus used many illustrations, or parables, as part of His teaching. A parable is simply an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And God even had some of His prophets act out various directions in order to teach that prophet, and of course the children of Israel, various lessons about living a holy and abundant life in Him. One such prophet whom God often used to dramatize His messages was Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 13, 1 through 11, we are told of a time when God had Jeremiah travel a great distance and do an unusual thing with a sash or belt in order to illustrate the need to use the gifts He has given to us. God's first command to Jeremiah was, "Go and get a linen waistband." Jeremiah, like Abraham many years before him, was known for his prompt obedience to God's direction, thus providing us with the first lesson of this fascinating parable. When God speaks, we need to listen, trust, and obey, even when the instructions sound a bit unusual. Jeremiah's next directive is to take the linen waistband to the Euphrates River, a place symbolic of the corrupting influence the Assyrians and Babylonians had over the people of Israel. When God grants us specific gifts, it is still our responsibility to use those gifts for His kingdom and not be ashamed or corrupted by outside influences that might prevent us from being obedient to God's call. But God not only told Jeremiah to travel a rather great distance with the waistband, He then instructed the prophet to hide it in a crevice of a rock near the river. The overall illustration is beginning to take shape, for too often we hide or neglect to use or perhaps misuse the gifts God has given to us. Unfortunately, the nature of Israel's people toward God had shifted from obedient action to sinful rebellion against the one who had led their ancestors out of Egyptian bondage. Therefore, the hidden belt, which eventually became wet, weather-worn, and useless, can represent either our wasted spiritual gifts or our willful disobedience to God's word, both of which are affected by those we allow to influence us. Jeremiah's portrayal of God's divine illustration should lead us to understand just how important it is to stay focused on who God is in us, rather than on the negative influence of corrupt individuals in our lives. Paul lays it out quite clearly in 1 Corinthians 15:33 when he states, "Be not deceived, bad company corrupts good morals." And yet, no matter how many times His people turned their backs on God, He exemplified His nature of patient endurance by continually forgiving His people and propelling them forward. One parable that Jesus used as a divine illustration provides an example of God's loving kindness and willingness to forgive, while also reminding us about how important it is for us to imitate His way of living rather than be driven by our own desires. In Matthew 18, Jesus expresses the extraordinary idea of forgiving someone up to 70 times 7, which we understand to mean an infinite number of times. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king, who represents God, who wished to settle accounts with his slaves." He then explains how the king forgave an enormous debt to one of his slaves, who had literally thrown himself at the feet of his master, crying pitifully for mercy, proclaiming, "Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything." Continuing with his use of exaggeration to prove a point, Jesus uses a figure of 10,000 talents, an amount equal to over 150 years' wages. Jesus might have been looking to the cross where He would indeed pay a debt He did not owe, and a debt we could never repay. Although this debt-ridden slave walked away grateful for his master's forgiveness, he went to another slave who owed him a measly amount of pocket change compared to what he had owed the king, and demanded he pay up on the spot. This greedy slave had not learned anything from his master's kindness and actually had his fellow slave thrown into prison. Word got back to the king, of course, about this atrocious act, so the king called him back to his throne room. "Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way I had mercy on you?" This phrase, "in the same way," is the key lesson behind this divine illustration, for we should treat others just as God treats us, with compassion and mercy. Like the hiding of the linen waistband in Jeremiah's story, this slave failed to use the gift of compassion and mercy on his fellow slave, even though his master had so graciously and profoundly given him such a huge debt. This is our call, folks, to live and love as Jesus lived and loved, and to be living illustrations for others. Thank you for joining us today, and please join us next time when we talk about divine inspiration.
You've been listening to Pastor Tom Tinker of Meriden, and this has been Bread of Life, a program to encourage you from God's Word.